This is Advanced Autonomy. I'm Luke Renner. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to a shift in supply chain as companies were forced to face the unpredictable nature of our world. Consumer behaviors, workflow processes, and even the ability to socially interact changed as a result of clogged ports, labor shortages, spikes in demand, material shortages, and much more. These disruptions accelerated the need for businesses to innovate and build a more resilient supply chain. My guest today is Melanie Stone. She recently wrote an article on the ways that autonomous vehicle technology can help us build supply chain resilience. And today we're going to dive into what she's discovered. Hi, Melanie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Luke. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to start by setting the stage a bit. The supply chain disruptions that you talk about that we experienced during the pandemic and continue to experience, what can you tell us about them? How serious are they compared to regular supply chain shortages?
Yeah, so in some ways they're very different and in other ways not so much. So with the pandemic, exactly like you just said, the world was faced with these unexpected changes that impacted supply chains. So labor shortages, shifting consumer demand, e-commerce booms, and so on. So in the second quarter of 2020 alone, U.S. manufacturing production actually reduced by a little more than 20%, so a large amount.
Wow.
Yeah, so however, today, supply chain disruptions have actually become a common part of doing business. So businesses are constantly experiencing frequent changes in their environments and really just in the global economy overall. So I actually wanted to bring up a McKinsey & Company report that I mentioned in my article. And this report talked about how they found that companies can now expect that supply chain disruptions lasting more than a month will happen every 3.7 years, which, as we know, in the grand scheme of things, is really not that long.
Yeah, it's not that long. It sounds like they're constantly having to deal with supply chain disruptions. And you can think about the speed that technology is changing, that new products are coming off of the assembly line. I'm both not surprised that it happens this often and also sort of wondering why it doesn't happen even more often, right? Because it just seems like so much can constantly be in flux.
Exactly.
It does sound like, though, that there was a major drop in production due to the pandemic. What'd you say, 20.2%?
Yeah, 20.2%.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge, right? So then, of course, that naturally leads to the main point of your article, which is this idea that given that supply chain is expected to disrupt, every 4 years or so, given the dramatic disruptions that happened during the pandemic, really the only solution is to build supply chain resiliency. And one of the things that you mentioned in your article is that the key to that is, quote unquote, more. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you really consider the definition of resiliency, it really just means being able to properly prepare, adapt, and recover from these unexpected changes. So in order to do this, in order to build a resilient supply chain, an organization needs more. This includes more technology, more flexibility, more agility and visibility, and insight, and more communication. So all of these things will help an organization remain robust throughout the supply chain disruptions.
Okay, so it sounds like by defining resilience as more, basically you're making the case that companies can make investments in more visibility, more analytics, more technology in order to gird themselves against these supply chain disruptions.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned in your article, of course, this is an autonomous vehicle company, are autonomous vehicles. And you posit that autonomous vehicles can be one of the technology investments that will help companies protect themselves against supply chain disruption.
AVs really help companies increase their flexibility and agility, bring more visibility and insight through analytics, and foster greater communication up and down the entire supply chain. So to summarize what you just said, the technology is really one of the solutions that makes it easier for organizations to get more.
Okay, so let's dive into those. The first one you mentioned was an increase in flexibility and agility, and you particularly highlight how autonomous vehicles can increase flexibility and agility by comparing them to AGVs or automated guided vehicles. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so AGVs have traditionally been used as an automation solution to help businesses maintain a strong supply chain. So these vehicles help increase production by handling repetitive tasks and also helping an organization expand their supply chain capacity. But in warehouses whose layouts need to respond to demand fluctuations, AGVs really lack this adaptability. So simply put, it's not really that easy to reroute an AGV. They run in a fixed loop like a train and are typically guided by magnetic tape or fixed wires. So changing that route isn't always a quick fix and can end up being very capital intensive. Okay. So to better understand this, we can consider an example of a warehouse that wanted to alter an AGV delivery task that, let's say, used magnetic wire navigation. So in this particular example, the warehouse would actually need to rip out and reroute the wires on the floor. So as you can imagine, this is pretty disruptive and becomes capital intensive.
Totally.
And then in turn, this can negatively affect their operational efficiency. Instead, autonomous vehicles can provide this added flexibility and adaptability that AGVs don't offer. So they are able to intelligently navigate or reroute in response to not only permanent, but also temporary changes to their route. So no need to rip out any sort of magnetic wires or tape with autonomous vehicles. So this really allows organizations to easily and quickly make alterations in real time, which in turn will help them build this resiliency that we're talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. So with AGVs, like there's all this infrastructure that you have to have in place, you know, magnets on the ground or other wiring and things like that. But with autonomous vehicles, you can do all of those changes on the software side. So if there are supply chain disruptions, if there's fluctuations that companies need to react to, then they can just hit a couple of buttons and they can completely reorganize at least the routes that these vehicles are running.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the second way you mentioned to build supply chain resiliency is via more visibility. So what can you tell us about that?
In order to answer this question, I want to highlight an Accenture report that I discussed in my article. So this report was really interesting because it found that of the top supply chain companies, those with greater visibility were more resilient. And then as a result of this visibility, past disruptions to their businesses had no impact on their profitability, which I thought was really interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, so with this in mind, by deploying autonomous vehicles, businesses can achieve the same level of visibility. So AVs will specifically capture their environment and use intelligent sensors to detect their surroundings. So they are taking in this data that can be used to monitor picking accuracy, warehouse productivity, throughput, inventory, and the list goes on. So as you can see, AVs really help businesses tap into this wealth of data that allows them to achieve this real-time insight into their operations, which is really important. And then to provide another example, if we consider an organization that uses forklifts to carry goods, they can use AVs to optimize their operations by using these analytics to observe any flaws in driving behavior, route patterns, or even picking errors. So as we can see, businesses can use these analytics to not only recognize areas of improvement, but also make more informed decisions when these supply chain disruptions do occur. So this is really key for an organization to optimize their operations and really just get goods to their customers faster.
Got it. So autonomous vehicles provide analytics that allow organizations to get real-time insight into their operations. And that is what helps them become more resilient. You also mentioned how by providing the data necessary to optimize how these organizations are run, autonomous vehicles could also predict supply chain issues. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so even if a crisis hasn't occurred yet, the analytics provided by AVs can really help organizations see fluctuations in supply early on, which will allow them to proactively respond. So we can talk about this here through visibility, And then we will actually talk about it later in terms of communication. But with visibility, we can look at during the pandemic as a good example. So during the pandemic, it was reported that companies with advanced analytical capabilities found it easier to understand these changing operational realities and generate these useful insights needed to plan for these short-term and long-term crisis responses. So an example would be of Nike. They use predictive analytics to understand patterns, and they actually were able to see through these patterns that they needed to reduce their production early on. So through this data, they were able to minimize impact on their operations, and they actually had a smaller drop in sales than their competitors.
Got it.
So as you can see, it can also help predict these supply chain issues, which will in turn result in greater resiliency.
So they're getting the tea leaves kind of early. They're getting early signals that things are changing. Yeah. And so, of course, as you mentioned, that would necessarily bring us to the next thing, which is communication. Because if there's tea leaves happening way down or way up the supply chain, communication is what's going to deliver that information across the chain.
Yeah, exactly. So autonomous vehicles provide supply chain resiliency by helping send information up and downstream within the supply chain. So there are tier 2 suppliers and there are tier 1 suppliers. AV technology can help businesses that are tier 2 suppliers better communicate with their customers about their output using real-time data. So a lot of times visibility into the supply chain stops at these tier 1 suppliers, and organizations actually know very little about their entire supply chain, which, as you can imagine, results in a lack of knowledge about disruptions that may be occurring to the suppliers that supply to your tier 1.
Totally.
So as seen with the pandemic, in order to create this resilience, companies really need to have visibility into their entire supply chain, not just their tier 1 suppliers. So if you could imagine, let's say tier 1, your tier 2 supplier has a delay of rubber. So it can be communicated with this AV technology to their buyers down the supply chain. So this will allow the company to better predict and plan for this rubber, their supplies, which creates this necessary end-to-end supply chain visibility that a lot of businesses are actually lacking.
Yeah. I think you've really hit on something here, because when people imagine industrial autonomous vehicles, when they're sort of thinking through the impact that it's going to have on their business, I think they're really imagining just the car itself driving itself. But it's a good point to remind everyone that you don't just get the car. You get all of this visibility, you get all of this analytics, and all of this insight can be used, to communicate up and down the supply chain, which of course is good for your customers. It's good for the people receiving your goods, but it's also good for your suppliers as well. So yeah, I think all of this has been super interesting and really illuminating. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.